Ethan Calloway was the kind of man who could walk into a crowded room and own it without saying a word. His towering frame wrapped in the kind of tailored suits that whispered wealth and authority, his dark hair swept back with effortless precision, and those piercing blue eyes, eyes that could stop someone mid-breath because they carried the weight of both charm and danger, as though he could see straight into the darkest corners of your soul. At 32, he had built an empire in the heart of New York City, mastering the ruthless real estate market and bending its players to his will. Yet behind the steel in his voice and the confidence in his stride lay a man who had long ago locked his heart behind unbreakable glass. His marriage to Claire Whitmore, 3 years in the making, was the kind of union that photographers adored. A match of stunning aesthetics, his aristocratic features perfectly paired with her radiant beauty, her sun-kissed skin glowing under crystal chandeliers, her curves a silent temptation in every dress she wore, her smile soft enough to disarm the most guarded soul. And yet, within the walls of their penthouse high above the city, theirs was a home steeped not in passion, but in an aching emptiness that neither dared to name. It wasn't born of indifference, for Ethan knew from the first moment he'd seen her that she was the most breathtaking woman he'd ever encountered. But beauty for him was a dangerous reminder, a doorway to vulnerability he had vowed never to walk through again after a betrayal in his youth had carved a scar too deep to heal, the kind of wound that taught a man to mistake distance for safety. Claire, for her part, had not stepped into this marriage blinded by fairy tales, for she had her own silent wars to fight, agreeing to this loveless arrangement out of duty, the weight of her family's debt pressing on her slender shoulders, a dying mother's whispered plea still echoing in her ears to protect her younger sister at any cost, even if it meant binding herself to a man whose heart she could never touch. In public, they were a picture-perfect couple, the kind that drew envy and admiration alike, her hand resting lightly on his arm at gala events, his gaze occasionally drifting to her with a look so practiced it could almost pass for adoration. Yet in private, their lives moved on parallel tracks that never crossed. Dinners taken at opposite ends of a polished mahogany table, where conversation was reduced to clipped mentions of business schedules and social obligations, the clinking of silverware often the loudest sound in the room. Nights spent behind separate doors in a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home, its expensive silence swallowing any trace of warmth. Still, beneath Claire's calm, gracious exterior lay a quiet ache, a longing not for grand gestures or extravagant gifts, but for something far simpler. The feel of his hand reaching for hers without reason, the sound of her name falling from his lips in a tone that belonged only to her. A single moment where his eyes softened because he saw her and not the world he was trying to control. Ethan, however, remained an impenetrable fortress, his carefully constructed detachment never faltering, as though allowing even a fraction of closeness would open the floodgates to everything he feared. And so the days turned into months, the months into years, their marriage like a still lake, beautiful from a distance, but beneath the surface, utterly lifeless. Neither of them spoke of the growing shadow between them, and yet, though they didn't know it, though they could not have guessed it in the quiet monotony of their separate lives, the fragile, cold balance they had sustained for 3 long years was already beginning to see rack. And the moment it did, nothing about their carefully drawn boundaries would ever be the same again. The storm that night was relentless, the kind that seemed to devour the city in shadow and silver, rain cascading down in furious sheets, the streets glistening beneath the glow of fractured streetlights as if the world itself had been reduced to reflections and noise. Claire stepped out of the black cab with care, her heels sinking slightly into the rain-slick pavement, the delicate silk of her pale champagne gown plastered to her skin, cold droplets racing down the curve of her neck as she hurried toward the glass doors of the penthouse building, clutching the small beaded clutch in her hand as though it could shield her from the bite of the night air. Inside, the elevator's ascent felt unusually long, the muted hum of its machinery only amplifying the sound of her own shallow breaths, and when the doors slid open, she stepped into the familiar stillness of the Calloway penthouse, its air warm yet heavy, the scent of cedar and expensive whiskey drifting toward her before she even saw him. Ethan sat in the low leather armchair before the fireplace, the light from the flames catching on the sharp lines of his jaw. His tailored shirt sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the strength in his forearms, one hand resting on the armrest, the other cradling a heavy crystal glass of amber liquor that glowed like molten gold in the flicker of the fire. His eyes were fixed on the flames, the kind of stare that told her his thoughts were far away, until the sound of her wet heels on the polished marble floor made him look up, and in that split second, something shifted. His gaze, usually cool and unreadable, softened in a way that felt like a rare confession, sweeping over her sodden hair clinging to her shoulders, the subtle tremble in her arms, the faint quiver of her lips drained pale by the cold, and before she could even speak, he was rising to his feet with a quiet determination, his movements fluid yet purposeful, closing the space between them in a way he hadn't in years. Without a word, he shrugged off his tailored charcoal coat, its weight and warmth still carrying the faint scent of his cologne, and draped it over her shoulders with surprising gentleness, his fingers brushing just briefly against the curve of her neck as he murmured, "You should have called me," his voice lower, almost unfamiliar in its softness. The words caught her off guard, not because of what he said, but because they were the first she'd heard from him in so long, that carried even the ghost of care, and for a heartbeat, she felt as though the walls between them had thinned enough to let a little light through. She met his eyes, searching for something she wasn't sure she'd find, but before she could speak, he had already stepped back, retreating to the shadows by the fire, lifting his glass once more as though nothing had happened at all, and the moment, whatever it had been, dissolved into the quiet hum of the rain against the glass. By morning, however, that fragile thread was not just gone but severed, replaced by a colder current that neither could name, and it began when Ethan, entering his private study with the intention of reviewing contracts, found a white envelope lying squarely in the center of his desk, unmarked save for his name written in an unfamiliar, hurried scrawl. Curiosity tinged with unease curled in his chest as he broke the seal, and a single glossy photograph slid into his hand. Claire, standing beneath the soft glow of an outdoor cafe light, her head tilted slightly toward a man whose arm wrapped securely around her waist, his lips dangerously close to her ear, his posture radiating the kind of intimacy that was unmistakable. Ethan stared at the image, the edges of his vision narrowing, his fingers tightening around the glossy pap, until it began to curl, a sharp, breathless ache spreading through his chest, as though someone had reached in and twisted something vital. It wasn't just the sting of jealousy, though that flared hot and unbidden. It was the deeper wound of recognition, the sudden reminder of why he had chosen distance in the first place, of how easily trust could be shattered when it was allowed to take root. And yet the pain was sharper because this was Claire, his wife in name, but never in truth, the woman he had kept at arm's length, yet somehow couldn't bear to imagine in another man's arms. He didn't slam the photograph onto the breakfast table demanding an explanation, didn't stride down the hall to confront her while the image still burned in his mind. No, Ethan Calloway's nature was to hold his cards close, to study the field before making his move, and so he slid the photograph into the top drawer of his desk, out of sight but already etched into memory, where it replayed itself every time he closed his eyes. From that moment, the walls around him, already tall, grew higher still, his voice when they spoke reduced again to measured neutral tones, his presence around her edged with a watchfulness she couldn't quite name, while inside, the storm churned with a ferocity he could barely contain. Every glance she gave her phone became a dagger, every smile she wore before stepping out the door, a spark thrown into the tinder of his suspicion. Every faint trace of perfume in the air after she passed him in the hall, a haunting reminder of what might be slipping away. He told himself he didn't care, that their arrangement had never been about closeness or love, but the truth gnawed at him in the long, sleepless hours when he lay staring at the ceiling in his darkened room. That for the first time in 3 years, the thought of losing Claire terrified him far more than the thought of letting her in ever had. The soft hum of the city outside Damien Huxley's penthouse was in stark contrast to the storm brewing inside. Claire sat at the far end of the glass dining table, her fingers curled around a porcelain coffee cup she had not touched in the last 10 minutes. The steam had already faded, much like the warmth between them. Damien stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands clasped behind his back, his blue eyes fixed on the skyline as though the answers to his questions lay hidden among the towering buildings. Claire's heart raced. She could feel the weight of his silence pressing against her chest. She knew that when Damien was this quiet, it was never a good sign. "I saw you," Damien said finally, his voice low but laced with accusation. Claire's eyes flicked up. "Saw me? Where?" He turned, his gaze locking onto hers with unsettling intensity. "Outside the Willow Cafe, talking to a man I've never seen before. Who is he, Claire?" The mention of the cafe made her pulse quicken. She forced her voice to remain steady. "He's just someone from my past. It's not what you think." Damien took a slow step forward. "Then tell me what I should think." Claire set the cup down with a soft clink. "It's complicated." "Complicated," Damien repeated, the word dripping with disbelief. "You've been disappearing in the evenings, Claire. You think I wouldn't notice?" She swallowed hard. "I wasn't hiding anything." "Then why are you lying to me?" His voice rose, sharp enough to cut the air between them. Her breath caught. She hated when he looked at her like this, like she was a puzzle he couldn't decide if he wanted to solve or destroy. The truth was tangled in layers she wasn't ready to peel back. "I'm not lying," she whispered, though the doubt in her own tone betrayed her. Damien's jaw tightened. "You think I can't tell when someone is keeping secrets? I built an empire by reading people." She looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "And yet you still don't understand me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Damien moved closer, each step echoing in her ears. He stopped just short of her chair, his presence a shadow that seemed to swallow the light around her. "If you're hiding something from me, Claire," he said softly, "I will find out." Her hands trembled under the table. She wanted to tell him everything, but the truth could destroy more than just their fragile marriage. "You're not the only one with eyes, Damien," she said finally, her voice steadying, "and you're not the only one keeping secrets." His gaze sharpened. "What are you implying?" She rose from her seat, squaring her shoulders. "I'm implying that whatever game you think you're playing, I'm not a pawn." Damien's lips curved into something between a smirk and a threat. "Careful, Claire. Games have winners and losers. And sometimes," she shot back, "they have casualties." The tension between them was like a taut wire ready to snap. Damien's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the moment. He glanced at it, his expression shifting into something unreadable. Without another word, he picked it up and walked toward the study, leaving Claire standing alone in the vast, cold dining room. As soon as he was gone, Claire exhaled shakily and moved toward the window. The city lights blurred in her vision, but she wasn't sure if it was from the distance or the tears threatening to fall. Her reflection stared back at her, polished, controlled, but hiding storms no one could see. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. Her fingers brushed over the faded ink, a phone number, and beneath it, 2 words, "Don't trust him." She closed her eyes, hearing again the warning she had received a week ago. It had come from the very man Damien had seen her with. Claire knew she couldn't ignore it any longer, but telling Damien the truth now, that could change everything, and she wasn't sure whether it would save her or ruin her. The dinner had begun like any other formal family gathering in Ethan Blackwood's world, lavish, cold, and suffocating. The tables stretched endlessly, covered in polished silverware, crystal glasses, and dishes so perfectly plated they looked untouchable. Conversations buzzed around like lazy wasps, each word dipped in wealth, status, and subtle condescension. Claire sat beside Ethan, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had learned to keep her presence minimal at these events. Years of his detachment had taught her that blending into the background was safer. She wore a soft emerald dress that hugged her figure without screaming for attention, though it seemed attention found her regardless. Halfway through the evening, Ethan's cousin, a smug man named Oliver, leaned forward with a smirk. "Ethan, he said loudly enough for the whole table to hear. "You've been hiding a treasure. If I had a wife that beautiful, I'd never let her out of my sight." The words hung in the air like poison. Forks paused mid-air. A few chuckles broke the silence, the kind that carried a hint of something ugly. Claire froze, her cheeks warming with embarrassment. She lowered her gaze, pretending to focus on her plate, wishing she could sink into the floor. But Ethan's chair scraped back suddenly, the sharp sound cutting through the hum of the dinner. "Oliver." Ethan's voice was calm, too calm, yet it carried a chill that silenced the table. His piercing blue eyes locked on his cousin. "Don't ever speak about my wife like that again." Oliver blinked, caught off guard. "Come on, I said, don't." Ethan's tone was low but edged with steel, the kind of voice that warned a man he was one breath away from regret. "She's not an ornament for your entertainment. Watch your words." The air in the room thickened. Even Ethan's father, a man not easily rattled, looked unsettled. Oliver walked nervously, mumbling something about a joke, but no one was laughing now. Claire's heart was pounding. She'd never seen Ethan like this. For years, she had been invisible to him. An obligation, a contract, not a wife. But here he was, defending her like she mattered. The rest of the dinner passed in tense quiet. Ethan spoke little, his jaw set, his hand resting possessively on the back of her chair. Claire didn't know if it was for show or something else entirely. When they finally left, the city night wrapped around them. The car ride to the penthouse was silent, but it wasn't the usual cold silence she'd grown accustomed to. This one felt heavy, charged, as if unspoken thoughts were crackling between them. Once inside, Ethan loosened his tie and headed straight for the bar in the corner of the living room. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his movements precise, almost deliberate. The golden liquid swirled in the glass as he leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on her. Claire hesitated near the door, her clutch still in hand. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. His brow arched. "Do what?" "Defend me. You could have ignored it, like always." Something flickered in his eyes, a mix of irritation and something deeper she couldn't name. He took a slow sip before answering. "I'm done ignoring a lot of things, Claire." Her pulse quickened. "What's that supposed to mean?" He set the glass down and took a step toward her. "It means I'm done pretending we're strangers." His voice was low, steady, but it carried a weight that made her breath catch. Claire's fingers tightened around her clutch. She searched his face, trying to read him. The Ethan she knew was always composed, distant, almost untouchable, but tonight there was heat in his eyes, a fire she had never seen before. "You've been my wife for years, but we've lived like we're nothing to each other," he continued, his gaze never wavering. "That ends now." Her mind was a storm. This was the man who had once looked at her as though she were invisible, who buried himself in work and left her to wander the empty halls of their marriage. And now he was standing here, looking at her like she was the only thing in the room worth seeing. She took a cautious step back, needing space, needing air. "Ethan, you can't just decide that after all this time." He closed the gap between them anyway, his voice softer now. "Maybe I should have decided sooner. Maybe I should have seen you sooner." Her breath hitched. Every nerve in her body felt alive under his stare. She hated that part of her, wanted to believe him, wanted to step into the warmth of this sudden attention. But another part remembered the years of cold. "What changed?" she asked, almost in a whisper. His lips curved slightly, not a smile but something sharper. "I realized I'm not ready to lose you." The words sank into her, heavy and disarming. She had no idea what they meant, no idea what he truly wanted from her. All she knew was that the silence between them had turned into something dangerous. And maybe, just maybe, something she couldn't walk away from. The rain fell in a steady silver curtain outside, a soft percussion against the vast windows that framed the city in fractured light, every drop streaking down the glass like the hours they had lost, too many to count. The air in the penthouse seemed charged, almost alive, as though the storm outside had found its way in, wrapping itself around them in invisible threads. Ethan stood a few feet away at first, his shoulders tense, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. And when he finally stepped forward, it was slow, deliberate, like a man crossing a threshold he could never return from, his voice breaking the silence with words that seemed to carry the weight of all the years between them. 3 years, Claire. I've been a fool, he said, the low timbre of his tone threading through her like something she had been starved to hear, his confession carrying both regret and a quiet resolve. His hand lifted, fingers brushing against her temple as he tucked a loose strand of damp hair behind her ear, the pad of his thumb lingering against the curve of her cheek as though memorizing the shape of her, his touch neither hurried nor hesitant, but steady, certain, the kind of touch that spoke of decisions already made. I thought keeping my distance would protect me, he went on, each syllable deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. But all it's done is make me lose time I can never get back. And the sincerity in his gaze was almost too much to bear, the storm outside a pale reflection of the turmoil inside him. She felt the ache in his voice as if it were her own, her breath catching as his other hand reached for hers, his fingers threading through hers with a surety that made it impossible for her to pull away even if she had wanted to, which she didn't. Their joined hands became an anchor in the vast, quiet space between them, drawing them closer until his forehead rested gently against hers, the faint warmth of his skin brushing her own, their breaths mingling in the small distance that remained. For a long moment, neither moved, as though the act of simply being near, of sharing the same air, was enough to undo years of silence, her lashes fluttering shut as she felt the subtle shift in him, the change from hesitation to certainty. When his lips finally touched hers, it was not the claim of a man who sought to possess, but the offering of a man who sought to give. A kiss that began with a softness almost fragile in its care, the ghost of a touch at first, testing the boundaries of the moment, before deepening with a restrained urgency that spoke of nights imagined but never lived. Her fingers tightened instinctively around his as the world beyond the windows blurred into nothing, the rain's steady rhythm fading into the background until all that existed was the press of his mouth against hers, the subtle tilt of his head as if to learn her again, the unspoken vow in the way he drew her closer, erasing the cold that had once filled the space between them. The kiss became a bridge, spanning every missed conversation, every glance that had been turned away, every night they had lain in separate worlds under the same roof, and with each heartbeat, each shared breath, something inside her began to thaw. His hands, still holding hers, grounded her in a way she hadn't realized she needed, the storm's light flashing across the sharp lines of his face when they finally broke for air. Though they didn't step back, didn't look away. His eyes, searching hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt, held the quiet echo of a promise. Not spoken aloud, but written in the way he remained close, the way he let the moment linger as though to seal it into memory. In that quiet, storm-lit room with the city sprawling beneath them and the rain painting streaks of silver across the night, the barriers they had built crumbled to dust, and though neither said the words, both knew something irrevocable had changed. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a beginning, a vow forged not in grand declarations, but in the simplest, most powerful truth. They were no longer strangers. For a brief and fragile moment, their lives felt like something close to perfect. The bitterness that had once wrapped around their hearts like winter frost had begun to thaw. There were mornings when Ethan woke to the sound of her soft humming in the kitchen, evenings spent under the glow of warm lamps, talking about nothing and everything. Sometimes she would rest her head against his shoulder while they watched the rain trace lazy paths down the windows, and he would press a gentle kiss to her hair. It wasn't grand gestures that made the change. It was the little things. The way she smiled more freely, the way he listened without the constant urge to defend himself. They were learning each other again, almost as if they'd stepped into a second courtship. But even in the sweetest moments, the photograph still haunted Ethan. It had been months since he'd seen it. The image of her with Mason, her hand in his, standing far too close under the streetlights. Every time he remembered it, a shadow fell across his chest. One late evening, when the house was quiet and the fire in the hearth crackled low, Ethan finally gave in to the weight pressing against his ribs. "Tell me about him," he said softly, his voice a mix of fear and demand. She was curled in the armchair, legs tucked under her, a blanket draped across her lap. Her eyes lifted to his, startled, then softened with something he didn't expect. Resignation. "Mason?" she whispered, as though saying the name might change everything. "Yes, Mason." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I saw the photograph, Sophia. I didn't want to believe it, but it's been sitting in the back of my mind for too long." The silence between them was fragile, like a glass bridge over a deep drop. Finally she exhaled, her shoulders sinking as if releasing a burden she'd carried far too long. "Mason was my best friend since I was 6, she began, her voice trembling, but steady enough to hold the truth. "We grew up in the same neighborhood. He was more than a friend, but not in the way you're thinking. He was the boy who defended me when the other kids laughed at my hand-me-down clothes. He was the one who sat with me when my father left, when my mother cried herself to sleep." She looked down at her hands, twisting the blanket between her fingers. "When we got married, Ethan, I was happy at first, but then came the distance, the coldness. You shut me out. I didn't have anyone here. Mason was the only person I could talk to without feeling like I was walking on eggshells. I met him in secret because I knew you'd never approve of him being in my life." Her voice cracked and her gaze finally met his. "I never betrayed you, Ethan. Not in the way you feared, but I was lonely, and I needed someone who reminded me I was still human." Ethan's chest felt tight, not from anger, but from something far worse, guilt. It hit him like an unrelenting tide. He had doubted her, punished her with silence, allowed his mother's poisonous whispers to stain his marriage. He had built walls between them, and then blamed her for not finding a way through them. His hands covered his face for a moment before he spoke. "I should have asked. I should have trusted you. God, Sophia, what have I done to you?" But the reprieve from misunderstanding was short-lived. The truth, however healing, carried its own sting. Ethan now knew exactly how much harm his mistrust had caused. The next morning he sought out Vivian. His mother was in the drawing room, a fine china teacup poised elegantly in her hand, as though she hadn't been the architect of years of tension. "You told me she was unfaithful," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "You put ideas in my head that never should have been there." Vivian's expression didn't falter. "I told you what any mother would. I protected you from—" "No," he cut her off, stepping closer. "You protected your pride, not me. You've been meddling in my marriage since day one, and I let you. But not anymore. You stay out of this, Mother. Stay out of us." For the first time in years, Vivian's poised mask cracked. Her eyes hardened, a storm gathering in their depths. "You think you've won her back?" she asked, her voice low and cold. "You have no idea, Ethan. That woman will be the ruin of you." But there was something in the way she said it, too deliberate, too pointed, that set a fresh unease stirring in his chest. He didn't know then, but Vivian had one last card to play, and she wasn't afraid to use it. The ballroom was alive with 100 glittering conversations, the air heavy with perfume and ambition, yet to Ethan it felt like a hollow shell compared to the singular heartbeat he could hear in his chest as his eyes fixed on Claire. She stood frozen near the far end of the stage, her soft, disbelieving gaze locked on him as if she couldn't decide whether this was another cruel twist of fate or the moment she had always secretly prayed for. His mind was still burning with the memory of Vivian's last poisonous words, her voice curling in his ear like smoke, reminding him that stepping toward Claire meant severing the gilded chains that had bound him to the Calloway Empire since birth. Chains made of money, privilege, and ruthless expectations. But instead of fear, Ethan felt a strange lightness, a clarity so sharp it made his chest ache. The wealth, The prestige, the towering skyscrapers etched with his family name, suddenly felt like dust compared to the quiet strength in Claire's trembling hands. He took one deliberate step toward the podium, his polished shoes clicking against the marble like a drumbeat in the stunned hush, and the crowd turned their glittering, curious eyes toward him. Investors clutching champagne flutes mid-sip, socialites tilting their diamond-encrusted heads, reporters poised with pens hovering above their notepads. Ethan wrapped his fingers around the microphone, his knuckles white, but his voice was steady as steel when he began to speak, cutting through the silence like the first crack of dawn. This is my wife, the woman I once failed, the woman I will never fail again. A murmur spread through the audience, a ripple of confusion, scion and intrigue, but he kept going, each word heavier, truer than the last. He told them that every fortune, every penthouse suite, every private jet could be stripped from him, and it would mean nothing if Claire was no longer by his side. He confessed, publicly without hesitation, that love had taught him more about worth than any ledger or contract ever had. The whispers grew louder, some gasps sharp enough to slice the air, but before anyone could twist his words, applause began. Soft at first, then swelling like a wave until the chandeliers trembled with the vibration. Ethan didn't smile for the cameras, didn't soak in the attention. He moved toward her, each step slow and deliberate, like a man walking through a lifetime of regret toward his only redemption. Claire's breath quickened, her lips parting in silent disbelief, and she gripped the fabric of her gown as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. When he reached her, he didn't say a word. His hands came up warm and sure, cupping her face in a gesture that spoke louder than any speech. The golden light caught the shimmer of tears in her eyes, and in that moment, the room, the guests, the opulence all faded away until it was only him and her, standing in the middle of a world that no longer had the power to keep them apart. His lips brushed hers in a kiss so gentle it felt like a promise written in air, yet beneath it was a certainty, a possession, a vow carved into stone. Cameras flashed like lightning, but neither of them flinched. They were no longer hiding, no longer pretending. From the edge of the ballroom, the sharp staccato of Vivian's heels echoed against the marble as she turned to leave, her departure dripping with fury, her shoulders stiff with the weight of losing a battle she thought she had already won. Ethan didn't watch her go. She had become irrelevant in the space of a single heartbeat. When he pulled back from Claire just enough to speak, his breath was warm against her cheek as he whispered, "You're mine, now and forever." And the way her eyes closed, the way her body leaned into him without hesitation, told him she finally believed it. She felt the ghosts of every lonely night, every unanswered tear, every unspoken fear dissolve into the warmth of his arms, and in that crowded, glittering room, filled with people who thrived on power and pretense, Claire knew they had just taken the most powerful step of their lives, one toward a future where love would not only survive but reign unchallenged, even in the face of every storm still waiting beyond those golden doors.